Happy Friday, everybody. It's Dave Evans and Doc Greg Vecchi with you today on SafeDefend Live. We're going to talk about the most important thing we can probably talk about when it comes to active killer incident in your school or your workplace. It's how do we identify the potential for an incident by a person's behavior before it happens, as opposed to trying to fix it when it happens. I think prevention's worth a pound of cure. So, Doc Vecchi, let's get after it.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me again. I always love doing these. Always look forward to Fridays. One for Safe Defend Live, and the other that it's the weekend following it. So that's always a good thing.
Absolutely.
So as I'm going through, looking at this problem, we have this concept of left and right of bang and all this other stuff. But the key thing here is that when people are talking about dealing with this problem of targeted violence or active killers, you have the wording or the see something, say something. Everybody just says that. See something, say something. Like somehow that's magically going to prevent it, right? Just like the run, hide, fight. Just like if you don't understand the nuances that of escape, evade, and engage, then run, hide, and fight really doesn't mean anything. It sounds like it's linear and it's hard to put into practice. And we've seen that when people take these words that are defined well and don't really understand the concepts, they get hurt. And one example was, I think it was back in 2018, there was this newspaper company in Washington D.C. I think it was called the Gazette, and they had 5 people die in this active killer situation, right? And this guy that did it, he got his grievance was started with the paper. They published something that made him look bad, and he spent 6 years trying to rectify it until finally it got to the point that he decided to go in there and start shooting everybody up, and that's what he did. 5 people died. And one of the things that was, when we go back to definitions, right, and using
Yep.
these, I don't know what you can call them, colloquialisms or these bumper sticker type approaches like run, hide, and fight, and see something, say something. Well, the people that died had some concept of run, hide, and fight. But one person, for example, tried to run, and she was killed. And so that's your run piece. But what she didn't understand about this concept of escaping is it's not just running, but it's also knowing your exits, knowing what's beyond your exits, and having an alternative exit. She knew to go to the exit, but she did not know that when that door was locked and barricaded, which she didn't understand, she got there and she actually was shot by the perpetrator because she froze because it was locked and she was expecting it to be unlocked because it was an exit, right? And she didn't have that training that's part of that escape process, right, or escape checklist that we teach as to, okay, if that doesn't work, alternate exit, right? So she got killed trying to run and it didn't work. We had 3 people in that very same situation that were killed hiding under a table because they didn't understand hide as it relates to cover and concealment. And they were like sitting ducks. They were under a table, and the offender saw them and simply killed them. And the last one that was killed was a lady who decided to confront the attacker, which we never expect them to do because it's not their job. But she understood fight to mean confront the attacker instead of protecting your threshold when you're locked down. And so these misunderstandings of terms or these bumper sticker messages that you see all the time don't work in real practice unless you truly understand the nuances and you understand definitions of what really happens in these situations. So that's an example of how run, hide, and fight is not a good approach
Well,
as far as training.
yeah, I
Right?
think it's I think it's interesting that the word you just said right now, having the bumper sticker is great, but it doesn't mean anything unless you train people to a standard of what that means, right? Um,
Absolutely.
and that's a unique thing that SafeDefend does for our clients, is that we make sure that we go in and have these day-long trainings. We go through drills. We show them what that means. And I think it's important, we're going to talk about assessing the threat before it happens here in a second. But as far as when it actually happens, if you don't know what to do and you don't drill and prepare for it, you might as well not do anything.
Yeah, and if you yeah, and not only that, if you drill the wrong thing, it's not practice makes perfect, it's perfect practice makes perfect. So
That's
if
a
you don't
fact.
have a checklist and best practices that's empirically based on understanding the offender behavior, number one, and number two, that it's going to work when you have your adrenaline rush and you're not body alarm response. If it doesn't work in those two situations, it's not going to work at all. And
That's a
that's what we
fact.
find, and but now going back to the let's look at the bumper sticker on the left hand side, right? Which is see something, say something. Okay. Again, good bumper sticker. It's a good slogan. It's people throw that out there all the time. You hear it a lot in airports, right? You see something, say something. But it's much harder to apply that simply. There is this oversimplification, right? Of like run, hide, and fight is oversimplified. See something, say something is oversimplified. So, for example, if you really truly understand what happens in these situations, you're going to know that these attackers are going to go through 10 steps every single time. Go ahead and put that slide up for me, that funnel
Coming
slide.
up.
All right. All right. So this is what they go through. Every single attacker, whether you know it or not, is going to go through these steps almost always. The problem is that the ability to prevent it requires you to intervene in those first 8 steps. Because if you wait until the breach and the attack, then now we're in a response mode. It's too late to prevent it. So we have to understand that, and I think there's a lot of information out there in terms of people understanding that it's not a snap effect. These offenders don't just snap. They develop some sort of a grievance. Rather, it's they feel persecuted, they feel wronged, they experience a significant loss associated with the location or another person, or maybe it's ideological, like terrorism, or maybe it's political or environmental or whatever their cause is, right? So we know that to be true, and then we also know that for the next thing to happen is that for it to become bad enough where violence becomes the answer, they have to be in a position where they can't cope with it anymore, they can't deal with it, and then they finally realize that violence is the answer because they can't even get anybody's help. In the previous example of that Gazette newspaper, this guy's uh, grievance against the newspaper started in like 2012, and he tried his best. He went to the editor, he went to the writer, he complained, tried to get it retracted. They wouldn't retract it. He went to law enforcement, even tried to sue them civilly. He wrote letters to the editor, all this stuff, right? And 6 years, finally, then he couldn't take it anymore and he realized, okay, I'm done. And so that's when he was on that path to violence. That's what we're trying to get to with schools, for example, workplaces. How do we know when someone is truly on this path and where are they on this pathway? Because that's going to dictate interdiction, intervention. It's going to dictate who to get involved when and things like this, right? So when they go through these steps, which every one of them do, the idea is to be able to observe their behavior and then make sense of that behavior, tie that behavior to one of these steps, and then intervene to end the crisis because they feel wronged, they feel out of options, they oftentimes feel hopeless and helpless. Not to excuse what they do or what they're planning to do, but these are people in crisis, just as we've talked about in nearly every one of these Safe Defend Live um, seminars that we have here, these talks. So what I'm looking at is that there are certain behaviors that are direct, which means that they are directly correlated to being on the pathway to violence. This is how, first and foremost, we eliminate false negatives and false positives. One of the biggest problems out there is that we assume the person's violent or we assume the person isn't violent and we're wrong. And the reason we're wrong is because we're basing it on things other than these types of behaviors, the crisis, the showing intent to commit violence against someone, leaking their intent, for example, researching and planning, looking at maps, looking at building lists and things like this. preparing, actually buying the gun or getting or obtaining the gun or other weapon they're going to use, and then the feasibility, checking it out, doing dry runs. These are the behaviors that count. But here's the deal: even if you know these behaviors, it's not as simple as that, because one behavior doesn't necessarily mean that the person's going to be violent. Just because someone gets an interest in guns doesn't mean that they're on the pathway to violence. So, what it takes to make this work is people that know the offender. So in a school, it's going to be the people that engage with this offender, or the potential offender, the student, the person in crisis, whoever that is, um, regularly, like every day. So your teachers, your peers, um, coaches, SROs at the school, and of course parents at home and other people in the kid's orbit that he regularly every day deals with, because it's only an understanding of what's normal for that kid from the perspective of all those people who are around him. That change in normalcy, or that change in behavior that doesn't fit right, an anomaly, is what you focus on as as a data point to analyze whether or not they are moving towards around or either even on the pathway. So it takes multiple observers and multiple observations of these behaviors, and someone who can has the training to assess this and analyze this to determine, is it low threat, is it moderate, is it high threat, is it imminent threat, right? And if you tie it to a low threat, that's obviously you're not going to get the police involved. But if you tie it to a higher imminent threat, you better get the police involved on this, because they are very close to the attack. And that's how this works. Now, the problem is observations and number of observations and who's observing. So if you look at three cases, right? You look at Parkland. Okay, Parkland happened in 2018. The offender was expelled in 2017. Okay, so if you look at it from that perspective, when he came in to do the attack, he was not part of that school at that time. So there were limited things, nearly impossible things, that the actual school people inside the school could really do to build this baseline and figure out, hey, this kid's a problem, we need to deal with it, because they had no idea he was going to come in that day and he'd been out for a year. Probably the same thing through the Nashville shooter was a former student. I think she was 10 years old when she was at that school the last, and she was, I think, 28 when she died. So 18 years ago. Well, obviously school would have no idea how to do a baseline on that. So even though both of those fit the stats that about 91% of the people are people that current or former students, the fact that you know them doesn't mean that you know them on a daily basis, or that you understand like what's normal for them, because you don't see them anymore, or you see them very occasionally. If you look at the University of North Carolina case that just happened, right? You have a graduate student who killed his advisor, his dissertation advisor. Okay, well, he had been part of that research team with that advisor since 2022, since January, so about a year and a half. So in that situation, if you have the threat assessment laid out correctly, you would have a much better chance of identifying that person on the pathway than you would the shooter at Nashville or the shooter at Parkland, for example. Okay. If you look at another area, like, for example, the Choctaw High School shooting that happened recently in Oklahoma, right? They were students, but they weren't. My understanding is that they were not students of the school where the football game was being held. So really, there's no former and there's no current baseline information that anyone in the school could have known about. Okay, so that's where the problem is. That's some of the problems with the threat assessment. But the question is, okay, how do we make that better? Because it's still going to require data, information, observations of people who are in crisis, and all the behaviors that are tied to this pathway. So again, getting the community involved. Threat assessment is not a siloed thing that only schools do internally, or that businesses do internally. There's got to be connections and things like this. So for example, if you look at the Parkland shooter, okay, he had bounced around Broward County schools for years because of his um, erratic behavior, which, by the way, much of it was already on the pathway, but no one took the time, or no one had the ability, or maybe the training to connect those dots, which they could have, because when he was expelled, he just went to another part of the Broward school system. So they still had the ability to baseline him if they all were working together instead of in a silo, right? And so in any threat assessment, it's beyond just the students and the teachers and the superintendent or the HR or the CEO in a business environment. It is not a siloed event. This has got to be community wide. It's got to be expanded. It's not about connecting the dots. It's about connecting the right dots in the right manner in a timely fashion. And so that's basically what I wanted to cover today. I'd like to know your thoughts on it. But it's simple, but at the same time, it's very, very nuanced and difficult if you don't really truly understand this problem.
Well, I think the more we can get people educated on what those signs are on the lethal violence funnel path, what actions or behaviors they need to be looking for, the more likely we are to prevent the next incident. And there's a lot of people out there trying to build these assessments. They aren't really the kind of assessment we're talking about. They're not what you have in your mind as to how to prevent this. And I think it's important for people to understand. Look, if you see a person that's having issues, it has a grievance, it's upset, you need to have the conversation. That's the first starting point today, right? If a kid gets in trouble for something, or something happens where they're being bullied and you notice it as an adult, you need to sit down and make sure they're okay and find a way to resolve the issue at hand. Sometimes people do things, they show the signs, but we don't ever connect the dots until after the fact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we go, why didn't we see that? Well, we didn't see it because we weren't looking for it. We were acting like ostriches and putting our head in the sand and going, well, it'll be okay. It's not that big a deal.
Yeah, and this whole dot connection thing, I think, is kind of oversimplified too, because everybody says we'll connect the dots. Well, if you're connecting the wrong dots, then the result is going to still be bad, right? You're not going to be effective, which means that there are other more indirect behaviors that sometimes happen, sometimes don't. Sometimes you're mentally ill, but you don't want to use mental illness, for example, as one of the dots to connect primarily. That can be an enhancer to the direct behaviors, but it is not correlated or causation of this. It can be an enhancer, and when you get, again, focused on the gun, focused on mental illness, focused on things that video games, violent video games, and you include all that stuff as part of your primary assessment, it's going to muddle it up, and you're going to get false negatives and false positives if you go that route.
Yeah, it's all about the grievance. I mean, we understand that pretty well, that there's something has happened, and you've got to take care of the root cause of the problem and focus on that, as opposed to all the enhancers that you just discussed. Those will cloud your judgment, and those will help you to make very bad decisions, which is going to end in somebody getting injured or killed.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And I think what you said just a little bit ago is really the bottom line. If everyone who senses someone that they know well, they sense that person's in a crisis, help them or get them help. If you would just do that, you would eliminate and prevent much of this problem.
Well, Doc, another great Friday morning discussion with you. I appreciate your time. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend.
You too.
And with that, and SafeDefend Live, Doc and Dave, we are out of here.
Have a great weekend. Thanks.